You know, I think that the cornerstone of our defence policy and the cornerstone of NATO has been deterrence, which is if you want to deter war from happening, you have to be ready for it.
We will deliver our commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, but we will bring it forward.
We're spending more on debt interest than on defence. Kemi Badenoch's words silenced the Labour benches as she systematically dismantled Starmer's ambitious 2.5% defence pledge. But what happens when political promises collide with economic reality? This isn't just about defence numbers. It's about whether Labour understands the fundamental relationship between economic strength and national security.
In the short term, it can only be funded through hard choices.
Watch as Badenoch exposes the contradiction at the heart of Starmer's plan. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favour. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now back to the video. The uncomfortable shifting in seats began as soon as Kemi Badenoch took to the dispatch box. Labour MPs who moments earlier had been nodding along to Starmer's grand promises about defence spending suddenly found themselves confronted with an uncomfortable economic reality. Badenoch didn't waste time with pleasantries. She went straight for the jugular of Labour's defence strategy. A 2.5% spending target sounds impressive when you're making campaign speeches, she pointed out, but impressive targets mean nothing without the economic foundations to support them. The camera panned to several Labour front benches, their confident smiles rapidly fading as Badenoch systematically dismantled their leader's flagship defence policy. What made Badenoch's critique so devastating wasn't just her command of the facts, but the way she framed the entire debate. We need a strong economy to pay for strong defence, she stated, a simple truth that exposed the contradiction at the heart of Labour's approach. While promising increased military spending, Labour simultaneously proposes economic policies that independent analysts suggest would weaken Britain's financial position, making their defence promises ring hollow. The most revealing moment came when Badenoch highlighted a shocking fiscal reality. The UK currently spends more servicing its debt than on actual defence. This statement landed like a bombshell in the chamber. Several Labour MPs visibly flinched, while others desperately shuffled through papers, searching for a counter-argument that simply wasn't there. The stark comparison between debt interest and defence spending crystallised everything wrong, with making ambitious security promises without economic credibility. Particularly telling was the reaction from Labour's Shadow Defence Secretary. Initially positioned with an air of confidence, his posture gradually collapsed throughout Badenoch's speech. By the end, he was hunched forward, whispering urgently to colleagues. The body language of a team that realises its carefully constructed narrative is unravelling in real time. The chamber's atmosphere shifted palpably as Badenoch methodically contrasted conservative economic realism with what she termed Labour's wishful thinking approach to defence. Conservative MPs grew increasingly animated, sensing blood in the water as their opponents' discomfort became impossible to hide. One Labour backbencher even left the chamber entirely, unable to bear the systematic dismantling of their party's position.
The British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has announced what he says amounts to the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War.
When Starmer finally rose to respond, the weakness of his rebuttal was telling. Rather than addressing the economic contradictions Badenoch had highlighted, he retreated to familiar talking points about NATO commitments and international partnerships. It was political evasion at its most transparent, sidestepping the fundamental question of how Labour would fund its defence ambitions while pursuing policies that could potentially weaken the economy.
We will deliver our commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, but we will bring it forward.
Behind the political theatre lies a deeper ideological battleground that few commentators have picked up on. When Badenoch describes herself as a conservative realist, while Starmer clings to the label of progressive internationalist, we're witnessing more than just political branding. These are fundamentally different worldviews with real-world implications for Britain's defence policy. This philosophical divide becomes starkly apparent in how each approaches defence funding.
I can announce this government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War.
Both leaders pay lip service to NATO commitments and Ukraine support.
I think that the cornerstone of our defence policy and the cornerstone of NATO has been deterrence, which is, if you want to deter war from happening, you have to be ready for it.
But Badenoch's critique cuts deeper than surface-level policy disagreements. She systematically dismantled Starmer's approach by exposing the contradiction at its core. How can one promise robust defence spending while simultaneously pursuing economic policies that weaken the very foundation needed to sustain it? What's particularly telling is how Starmer responded, or rather failed to respond, to this challenge.
The principle of winning peace through strength. So we will continue to stand behind the people of Ukraine.
Rather than addressing the economic contradictions Badenoch highlighted, he pivoted to familiar rhetoric about international cooperation and alliance building. It's a clever parliamentary tactic, but it leaves the central question unanswered. Where's the money coming from? The Institute for Fiscal Studies hasn't minced words about Labour's defence funding plans, labelling them misleading and opaque. Independent analysts have gone further, stating bluntly that Labour's funding mechanisms simply do not add up. These aren't partisan attacks, but sober economic assessments from respected institutions. Perhaps most revealing is Starmer's uncomfortable position regarding overseas development funding.
That means spending £13.4 billion more on defence every year from 2027.
His struggle to reconcile ambitious development pledges with defence spending targets amounts to a tacit admission that Badenoch's economic critique holds water. You can't promise everything to everyone without eventually hitting economic reality.
I think the issue here is that the amount we need to spend to deliver that strength to ensure peace is going to go up.
The 2.5% defence spending pledge sounds impressive until you examine the economic assumptions underpinning it. Badenoch's methodical examination revealed that Labour's plans rely on growth projections that most economists consider wildly optimistic. It's the political equivalent of planning your household budget, assuming you'll win the lottery next month. What's truly concerning is that this pattern extends far beyond defence policy. The same approach, bold promises without economic foundations, appears to characterise Starmer's entire governance philosophy. Grand visions require practical means to achieve them, and this is where the progressive internationalist worldview collides with harsh economic realities. History has taught us painful lessons about the consequences of separating defence promises from economic reality. After World War I, the UK slashed military spending to appease voters with short-term savings, leaving the nation woefully unprepared when threats emerged in the 1930s. This parliamentary showdown between Badenoch and Starmer isn't merely political theatre, it's a warning. The disturbing pattern in Starmer's approach extends well beyond defence policy. Economic analysts have repeatedly flagged his public spending pledges as unrealistic, lacking credible funding sources, and built on wishful thinking rather than sound fiscal planning. By prioritising politically appealing targets over economic fundamentals, Starmer risks compromising the very security he claims to champion. What we're witnessing is governance by wishful thinking, a dangerous approach where political promises are disconnected from economic capabilities. The stakes couldn't be higher. When national security depends on economic strength, promising what you cannot deliver doesn't just break faith with voters, it potentially leaves the country vulnerable when threats materialise.